There is a kind of silence that is not the absence of sound. It is the presence of something that stopped. You know the difference when you encounter it. A room where someone was working an hour ago, the chair still angled, the glass still holding the ring of what it contained, carries a different quality than a room that was never occupied. The silence is the same to the ear. It is not the same to anything deeper than the ear. One silence is neutral, the other is the residue of cessation. The other is what remains when something that was happening is no longer happening, and you are standing in the aftermath without knowing what the thing was. I want you to sit inside that distinction for a moment before I give you any numbers, because the numbers will mean nothing until you understand what kind of silence they describe. The question that has been framing itself as a scientific puzzle for the better part of a century, where is everyone? Why haven't we heard anything? Why is the sky dark and the frequencies empty? That question has been treated as a mystery about distance, about whether life is rare, whether intelligence is rarer, whether the gap between us and the nearest civilization is simply too large for any signal to have bridged. That is one way to read the silence. It is not the most precise way. Precision, in my experience, is almost always more uncomfortable than approximation. Approximation leaves room, precision closes it. So let me be precise, and let me ask you to feel what the precision reveals rather than merely note it. The galaxy we inhabit is approximately 100,000 light years in diameter. It contains somewhere between 100 billion and 400 billion stars. Those numbers are large enough to be meaningless without something concrete to anchor them, so anchor them this way. If you reduce the entire Milky Way to the size of the continental United States, the distance from us to our nearest stellar neighbor would be approximately 40 meters. The whole galaxy, a continent. Our nearest neighbor, across the room. This is the scale we are working with. Not a vast unreachable darkness, but, in relative terms, something closer to a neighborhood. Sparse, yes, silent, but not, and this is the part that requires attention, inherently unreachable, a civilization with the capacity to construct a self-replicating probe, a machine that arrives at a new star system, acquires local resources, and builds copies of itself, which then depart for the next system, and the next, each generation replicating and dispersing such a civilization would, under conservative assumptions, see the entire galaxy within 5 to 10 million years. 5 to 10 million years is not a short time in human terms, it is an eye blink in geological terms. It is a rounding error in the life of a galaxy that is 13 billion years old. If even one civilization in the history of this galaxy had achieved that capacity and chosen to use it, the probes should be here. They should be in this solar system. They should have been here, by most estimates, billions of years before the Earth had finished forming. They are not here. That is the observation. That is the thing the math is trying to explain. And here is where most treatments of this problem make what I consider to be a category error. They treat the silence as a statement about the frequency of life, about the probability that intelligence arises, about filters and barriers and the rarity of whatever it is we are. They ask how unlikely is it that anyone else got this far, and they adjust the probability downward until the math clears, until the silence makes sense as an empty universe. I want to suggest that this is the wrong question arranged in the wrong direction. The question is not how unlikely it is that anyone got this far. The question is how long anyone who got this far managed to stay there. These are not the same question. They yield entirely different universes. Consider the following. The Earth is 4.5 billion years old. Complex life has existed here for roughly 600 million years. Anatomically modern humans have existed for perhaps 300,000 years. Civilizations capable of manipulating energy at an industrial scale have existed for, generously, 300 years. The window during which we have been capable of sending signals into space, or receiving them, is approximately 100 years. 100 years out of 4.5 billion. If you collapse the entire history of this planet into a single calendar year, we became technologically detectable at approximately 11 hours, 59 minutes, and 58 seconds on the final day, 2 seconds before midnight. 2 seconds. Now ask yourself, what are the odds that two civilizations, each with a 2-second window in a 4.5 billion year story, happen to have their 2 seconds overlap? This is not a question about distance. This is a question about time. And when you reframe it as a question about time, the silence stops meaning what you thought it meant. An empty universe, one in which we are genuinely the only technological civilization that has ever existed, and a universe full of civilizations that rose and fell before we arrived, each leaving nothing behind that could reach us, or nothing we yet know how to receive, these two universes look identical from the inside, they produce the same observation, they generate the same silence, and the precision required to distinguish between them is the precision that the math, if you follow it honestly, keeps pointing away from. What the math actually prefers, what the structure of the problem suggests when you stop trying to make the silence comfortable, is the second universe, the full one, the one where the galaxy has been occupied and explored and thought through and argued over, and where civilizations have risen and achieved things we cannot yet imagine, and then, for reasons we can partially enumerate but cannot fully predict, stopped. The universe where the silence is not emptiness, the universe where the silence is the accumulated cessation of everyone who came before. Let me tell you what that feels like to hold as a possibility before I tell you what it implies. It feels like arriving at a library after a fire. The structure is intact, the shelves are there, but everything that was on them is gone, and you cannot know what you are not reading. You cannot grieve a specific loss because you do not know the specific thing that was lost. You only know from the shape of what remains that something was there, that shelves imply books, that books imply minds, that minds imply everything, that minds produce fear, hope, curiosity, the specific quality of a question asked into darkness and not answered, all of it gone, all of it leaving nothing but an absence shaped like presence. The von Neumann probe argument was meant to demonstrate that the galaxy should be full, that a single civilization with sufficient technology and sufficient time could saturate an entire galaxy with its presence in a time frame that is, cosmically speaking, trivial. The argument was constructed as evidence that the silence is strange, that if anyone had been out there with the means and the time, we would know. We would see the probes, we would feel the reorganization of matter. We would hear the signal that a civilization leaves when it is working at scale. We hear none of it. And the first instinct, the instinct I am asking you to examine, is to conclude from this that no one had the means, no one reached the point. The filter is behind us or ahead of us or built into the improbability of the journey, and we are alone, and the silence is the sound of a universe that never got loud. Here is where I want to turn, because what I just described is not the only conclusion the evidence supports, and it is not the one that follows most naturally from everything else we know. Everything we know about complex systems, about the way organized structures behave when they encounter entropy, when they encounter their own internal contradictions, when they encounter the simple arithmetic of resource and demand, points toward the same pattern. Systems that achieve high complexity are fragile in proportion to their complexity. Not always, not inevitably, but with a frequency that at scale becomes a kind of law. The most elaborate thing is the thing most sensitive to disturbance. The most powerful civilization is the one with the most ways to fail. We can name some of the ways. We have been watching ourselves approach several of them simultaneously for long enough that the approach no longer surprises anyone paying attention. The weaponization of knowledge, the acceleration of environmental alteration beyond the rate of social adaptation, the tendency of cognitive sophistication to produce rationalizations for actions that simple organisms would recognize as fatal, the specific human and perhaps universal capacity to model a catastrophe in complete detail and then do the thing that produces it anyway, because the incentive structure of the immediate moment outweighs the incentive structure of the distant consequence. None of this is certain. I am not telling you we are doomed. I am telling you that the architecture of the problem suggests a reason for the silence that does not require an empty universe. It requires a universe where the window, the specific interval during which a civilization is both capable of reaching out and still present enough to sustain that reaching, is far narrower than the timescales involved. Imagine a lighthouse on a rotating coast. The light sweeps. At any given moment, it illuminates a specific arc of the sea. The ships on the sea are also moving. The probability that a specific ship and a specific sweep of light coincide is not zero, but it is low, and it declines as the ships multiply and move on different schedules, and it approaches something very small indeed if the lighthouse itself has a habit of going dark. That is the situation. Not the darkness of an empty sea. The darkness of a sea full of ships whose lights are out, whose crews have been and gone, whose wakes have long since flattened into the indistinguishable surface of water that has forgotten it was ever disturbed. And here is the second turn, the one the argument has been building toward without announcing itself, the one that changes what the silence is about. We have been treating this as a question about them, about whether they exist, whether they reached out, whether they are waiting for us somewhere in the frequencies we haven't searched yet, around the stars we haven't pointed instruments toward. We have been imagining ourselves as recipients, as the civilization that, if the others are out there, might one day receive a message that changes everything. We have positioned ourselves in the waiting posture, the listening posture, the posture of an audience anticipating a signal from something older and stranger and more capable than we are. But the math does not position us as recipients. The math positions us as senders. Or more precisely, the math positions us as the current iteration of the thing that every civilization in this argument is. And the question that the structure of the problem is actually asking, the question underneath all the questions about them, is a question about us. We are, at this moment in history, a civilization inside the window. We are the 2 seconds before midnight on a 4.5 billion year clock. We have the capacity to send, and the capacity to build, and the capacity theoretically, presently, right now, to become the thing that fills the galaxy with evidence of thought. The self-replicating probe is not a fantasy of the distant future. The principles are understood. The constraints are engineering, not physics. What stands between us and the saturation of a galaxy is not the impossibility of the task, but the survival of the thing attempting it. And that is not guaranteed. I want you to feel the weight of that before I continue, because it is easy to let it pass as an abstract concern, the kind of thing one acknowledges and then moves past. The window is finite. Every civilization that ever existed, or may have existed, or tried to reach out across the frequencies and found nothing, answering every one of them was inside a window. The window is not a metaphor. It is the actual interval of time during which the question of contact is alive, during which the capacity exists and the existence persists, during which the math could go differently than it has. The window is the only place where the story can change. We are in it now. What we do inside it, whether we narrow it through our own action or expand it through deliberate effort, whether we send anything worth receiving or leave only the traces of a civilization that was briefly capable and then ceased, that determines what the silence means for whoever comes after us. If anyone comes after us, if the after us is not simply more silence, let me put this more precisely, because precision is what this moment requires. The galaxy has had approximately 10 billion years to produce technological civilizations since the first generation of metal-rich stars began dying and seeding their neighborhoods with the building blocks of chemistry. 10 billion years. In that time, the matter exists for thousands of civilizations to have risen and reached, and, if they lasted long enough, remade. We have found no evidence that any of them did. We have found no megastructures, no Dyson signatures, no re-engineered stellar outputs, no probes of non-biological origin waiting in the Oort cloud or the asteroid belt or anywhere we have looked carefully enough to notice. The absence of those things is, again, consistent with two universes. But it is disproportionately consistent with one of them, the one where the window is narrow, where the capacity and the survival don't overlap long enough to produce permanent evidence, where civilization after civilization achieves the ability to remake the galaxy and then fails to survive long enough to begin. That is the reality check. Not a calculation about frequency, a calculation about duration, about how long the thing that can think and reach and build and decide actually persists, about whether the intelligence that emerges from biological and chemical and physical contingency contains, built into its architecture, something that shortens the window in proportion to its own sophistication. The tragedy of that possibility, and I use the word tragedy with precision, not with affect, is not that intelligence is rare. It is that intelligence may be common and brief, that the universe may be, or may have been, full of minds, and that minds may be, in the long accounting, incapable of lasting long enough to find each other, full libraries, all burning, none of them knowing the others existed, none of them leaving anything behind that reached anyone who could understand it. What would it mean to know that? What would it mean not merely as a fact about astrophysics, but as a condition of being the mind that knows it? It would mean that we are, in some sense, the inheritors of everything that was thought in this galaxy and never passed on. We are not the first. The weight of probability argues that we are not even close to the first. But we may be among the last who will wonder whether we are alone, because wondering requires a window, and the window is not infinite, and what we do with the time inside it is the only thing that changes the ending. The von Neumann reality check is not that no one built a probe. It is that building the probe and lasting long enough for the probe to matter are two different achievements, and the second one is harder in ways that no engineering can fully address. The probe is physics, the lasting is something else. The lasting requires that the thing doing the lasting wants to continue more than it wants, whatever it is that civilizations destroy themselves trying to obtain. And that desire, the desire to persist, the choice of duration over intensity, the specific discipline of not becoming your own filter, is not guaranteed by intelligence. It may not even be correlated with intelligence. It may be, in the most uncomfortable version of this argument, inversely correlated. The smarter the thing, the more capable it is of finding sophisticated reasons to do the fatal thing. The more powerful the tool, the more complete the damage it can produce when turned in the wrong direction. I find myself returning to the silence, not as a puzzle, as a condition. The silence of the galaxy is not waiting for an answer. It is not a question being held open by the universe in anticipation of our response. It is what it is, the accumulated result of everything that has happened in this galaxy over 10 billion years, of stars making the conditions for chemistry, and chemistry making the conditions for life, and life making the conditions for minds that can briefly look at the darkness and ask, what is out there? What is out there is the silence that everyone else made when they stopped. And we are in it. We are inside the silence that we have not yet made. The silence that is still our future, not our past. The silence we are moving toward at a rate and along a trajectory that we can still, today, at this moment, and no earlier and no later, influence. That is the only form in which the Fermi question has an answer that is not purely retrospective, not what happened to them, not what the math says about the frequency of emergence, but what we do with the knowledge that the window is finite, that the silence is not a mystery about others, but a mirror held up to us, that the von Neumann probe, the machine that could fill a galaxy with evidence of mind, requires for its deployment something that no self-replicating machine can supply, which is a civilization alive long enough to send it. We are alive now, we are inside the window now, and the silence is waiting with the particular patience of something that has no preference for outcomes. The universe does not care whether we manage to be the exception. It has not cared before. It will not grieve if we join the accumulated cessation. The only thing that cares is the thing doing the thinking. The only thing that cares is you sitting with this, unable to close it the way you close a puzzle when it's solved, because this is not a puzzle. This is a condition, the condition of being the mind that knows enough to understand its own contingency and not enough to be certain of its own continuation, and present right now, still present in the only interval that matters. The silence is not behind us, not yet. What we make of that is the only question the math cannot answer.